would absolutely love to have you.
Tickets are cheap to get down there now.
You ought to think about, we don't do it right. We haven't done it this year, but in New Orleans, we actually have Entrepreneur Week that they host here every year. And it's always in the spring. In fact, it was the very first event that was canceled because of COVID-19 last year. And it's a whole week that's put on by Tulane's LePage Center, the Idea Village, all of the universities around the city host events for Entrepreneur Week, and they'll have satellite events all over the city. And I'd love to have you down as one of the speakers for that. And I'm
really fun.
Yeah. So if we do end up hosting it, probably not this year coming up, but in the next year, I'll give you all the details of it. I'd love to have you for that. It'd be a great time.
Yeah. 2022.
Yeah, 2022 is where I think things are going to start. Or maybe middle of 2021. It depends on things, vaccines, everything else. It's just been a crazy year for 2020. I don't know, but Entrepreneur Week's a great event, and then Startup Grind actually hosts every year in Redwood City, and of course we're not doing it this year, but it's always right around Mardi Gras that they host it, and it's their big international meeting, and that one's about 8,000 people that they have at that, and you will run into venture capital investors. You will run into a lot of the biggest names in angel investors, capital investors, and startup companies. It's crazy. It's really like the rock star convention. The first time I went, I was just blown away by it. So I can, if they're going to do it virtual this year, and I can send you the information on that.
That's in California.
It's virtual, yeah. So it's always in Redwood City, but this year, as I understand it, it's just going to be a virtual event. I don't have all the details on it, but I do have some. And so I'd love to have you go to that also. And I think, cool. Again, the work that you do is something that is different from all of the other books and information that I've read about business development, business startup, and it's a niche that I think a lot of people don't think about when they first start a company, because a lot of times, it's one of your friends that you're working with,
right?
And you tend to have that sitting at a restaurant or a bar, and you have that idea that comes to you, while you're talking with a friend of yours, and you say, oh, well, why don't we split this 50-50? And everybody, I want you to talk about your book yourself, but my own personal experience has been, everybody looks at this and says, oh, this is a great idea, 50-50 it is. And then half a year later, one of those partners that have split it 50-50 are sitting there going, well, I'm putting in all the work, and you're just kind of coasting, saying I'm the owner of the company. And I know, you've seen probably horror stories with that over and over again. It just amazes me that there's not more, at the founder side, in all of the incubators that I've come across, that there's not more emphasis on that part from the very beginning. Like, right. How do you select those people that are going to work with you and mesh with you in a positive way, instead of kind of detracting away from the company where, it's well, I just want my piece to begin with. How do you do those things? So we're starting to get a couple people on here. Let's see, it's 5:07. Let's like at about 5:10, I guess. We'll kind of get started, and I'll let you go through and talk about what slicing pie actually is, because I think, again, it's to me, the more I've read the book, it became a really simple concept. At first, like, none of this makes sense. And then as I started reading through the book, and by the second time I got through your book, I sat there and said, okay, now this is starting to really make sense. And I love the fact that you continually bring up the idea of having a fair equity split. That it's something that's underrated sometimes in business. That you want what you deserve, but you don't want anything that's not fair, and you don't want to take something from anybody else that's not fair either. So. So do you mind kind of running through, slicing pie and talking to us a little bit about it and how it works? How did you come up with the concept? I know you've got some slides to run through. And
still there?
Yep, still here. Can you hear me?
Oh. Yeah. Well, what you're talking about is just what I experienced as well. There's just not a good resource for equity splits anywhere. Growing up as an entrepreneur, my first startup was in college, and I had a lot of friends who wanted to be part of it. And I was paralyzed by this idea of how do I share the money with them, because I was making enough to make my own living, but not enough to pay somebody else's living. And this idea that I had to share it somehow, and they wanted to be partners, it was just paralyzing. So I didn't wind up hiring people and paying them, and I had to grow the company to do so. And when I got to graduate school, again, there's no one could answer the questions. Back when I started my first company, there wasn't the communities they have now. It's much better now than it was back then. But I just never found a good straight answer. It was always, what's your forecast? How much you're going to raise? What are you going to do? It's all about what you are going to do. And I did some deals, some startups. I did a startup that was loosely based on slicing pie when I got out of graduate school. And one thing I noticed was that there was no incentive for people to spend any money on the company. It was all my money. So I struggled with how to provide the proper kind of incentives. If I was giving you, $50 per hour, not in unpaid salary, was much easier than putting $50 cash in the company. That's one thing I noticed along the way. And that company, I did a terrible equity deal with that, with the investors, the angel investors. Had I known better, I wouldn't have done that. And that drove the company out of business. And then I joined another company that I was a co-founder of. And my partner, we hired a team, and we gave them all equity. And then my partner pushed them out one by one and got their equity back for next to nothing. He probably bought my shares back and sold them for 10 times what it paid him for or more. Just turned around. And so it was just, there was no good answers for this. And that's when I sort of sat down and sort of hammered out what I thought an approach might be as a white paper. This is back in 2008. And originally I thought it was kind of a hacker's guide to sort of understanding what contributions were and how contributions were played against one another. But what I've realized over the years is that fairness isn't a matter of opinions. It's a matter of facts. It should be based on what actually happens, not what we think is going to happen, what we say is going to happen, but what actually happens. If it's done right, then our versions of fair should be the same. If we have two different versions of fair, then one of us or both of us has to be wrong. So if our dad gives us a cookie, the only fair way to split the cookie is half and half, right? You break it in half and I pick the side I want. There's no other way to do it because we both paid equal amounts of nothing to get the cookie. So because business is quantifiable, it's possible to come up with that number. And it's one of the nice areas of life where it is quantifiable. There's lots of areas of justice that aren't quantifiable. Like homicide, for instance. What's a fair prison sentence for a murderer? Is it a whole life or 10 years? Or it's much harder to tell that because it's not quantifiable in the same way the business is. Or what's the right penalty for a parking ticket? It's not quantifiable in the same way. So that's where Slicing Pie came from. If you want, I can share my screen and go through a short presentation about how this works.
Sure, absolutely.
I find that a little visual aid helps people kind of tell a lot what's going on. Yeah. So can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
So the goal, as you mentioned before, the goal is to make perfectly fair equity splits for early stage bootstrap companies. So the bootstrapping stage is when you're not getting paid. And companies, founders start their companies and they're just not paid. And it's an unusual thing if you think about it. Most companies are expected to pay their bills, but startup companies are not. So we have to do some kind of deal with our co-founders to make sure that we're getting properly, rewarded for our efforts. And it's usually the first deal people do is this equity deal. They sit around and think, what's our deal going to be? Like you said before, sitting at the restaurant, how are we going to split it up? It's the first major deal that you do, and it can be devastating if you do it wrong. So what people have in their minds loosely is that your share should be the value of your contribution divided by the total value of the firm. So ideally, this is what you get. The problem is we don't know either of these numbers. We can never know what the value of your contribution is going to be because you haven't done it yet. And we can never know the value of the firm.
Yes.
Because we can't tell the future. So what we get is a conversation that looks like this. Your promises divided by my dreams. I dream the company's going to be worth $1 billion someday, and you promise you're going to do a ton of work. And I say, if I give you 1%, you're going to be rich beyond your wildest dreams. And it's a ridiculous conversation. But unfortunately, we go to lawyers and advisors and professors, and we find people in our communities and our networks that are smart, successful, well-meaning, well-intentioned people that give us advice that just doesn't work. What's your financial statement going to look like in 2 years? Or what's the rule of thumb for someone in a CTO in San Francisco? All these things are crystal ball predictions. They're not real. And when they come out of that, the conversation is what's called a fixed equity split. A fixed equity split is when we divide up equity at the outset of the venture before anything's actually happened. When the most ambiguity is there, we divide up equity in chunks. So we do like a 60-40 split. Maybe it's your idea, so I think I get 40%. Or it's 51-49 because you want to maintain control. Any set chunk of equity expressed as a percentage is a fixed equity split. And usually people go, screw it, let's keep it simple, we'll go 50-50. Or a third, a third, a third. Divide 100% by how many partners we have. Mm-hmm. The problem is, whatever we thought was going to happen isn't going to happen. So if we're 50-50 and you do all the work, I own half your company, and you're stuck with me. Or what if we're 50-50 and we bring in another guy? You're a technology person, I'm a marketing person. We're hiring a marketing person. Does it come out of my share or your share? Or if you want to quit, what if I want to quit? There's a million things that can happen. And whenever those things happen, the split that you made up in the beginning is going to be wrong. And that's the fundamental problem we have. And there's two ways it can be wrong. The first way, it can be you can have greater than your fair share. It means you're getting more than your fair share. Now, lots of people are okay with that. They figure if it's going to be wrong, it might as well be wrong in my favor. But no one's okay having less than their fair share. And I call these alligator pit negotiations. Now, you're in New Orleans. You're familiar with alligator pits, right?
Yes. Oh, yes.
If you're in an alligator pit, your instinct is to get out of it as fast as possible, to get as much as you can for yourself. And it's every man for himself. It's just not the kind of cooperation you want to bring to the table. So you do a fixed split, and you'll fight about it later. So I call it the fix and fight method. And you fight about it, and what you come up with is another fixed split, and it's not fair again. And if it's not fair, it won't be fun. And startups at least should be fun because they're not usually successful. So we should at least have fun when we're doing them. So if it's fair, it'll be fun. And one of the best analogies that I've come up with for this is a game of blackjack. Do you know how to play blackjack?
Yes.
So let's pretend that you and I are going to play blackjack as a team, not opponents, but as a team. And we agree to split the winnings 50-50 because we're friends. So we go to the table, and I put down a chip, and you put down a chip. We don't know if we're going to win. We don't know how much we're going to win. We don't know how long it's going to take to win. All we know for sure is that we each bet one chip. So the dealer deals an ace and another ace. This is good, right? We're going to split them and double down, okay? So we split them, but I'm out of cash, you're not. So you put two more chips down. So now you've bet 3 chips, and I've only bet 1 chip. So we still don't know if we're going to win, or how much we're going to win, or how long it's going to take to win. All we know for sure is that you bet 3, and I bet 1. If we win, does 50-50 sound fair?
Not anymore.
No, it should be 75-25, right?
Yeah.
Your share of the winnings should reflect your share of the bets. So startups are exactly the same thing, but instead of betting on cards, you're betting on ideas. And you bet time and money and relationships and facilities and supplies and equipment. The betting continues until the company can afford to pay for its own bills, which is break even or a Series A. So as long as you're not getting paid for your contributions and not getting reimbursed for your expenses, you're essentially betting. And the value of your bet is always equal to the fair market value of your contribution. So you're not worth more than you're worth just because you're working for a startup, and you're not worth less. You're worth what you're worth on the fair market. That's what you could buy and sell things for on the market. So go on.
I've got a question there because in your book, you go over multipliers, though, correct?
Yes.
And so I'm probably getting ahead of myself with this, but sorry. And before I forget, I hate to break your continuity here, but I've both Kenneth and Serena just joined on a couple minutes ago, so I wanted to bring them in. So Kenneth's from our Canada chapter, and he's wanted to co-host this. So some of his members are coming in, and like I said, Serena Phoenix is a co-host that a co-director for New Orleans. So I just wanted to introduce them real quick and bring them on board, in the chat window down here while you're talking. But please go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No problem at all. Yeah, the multipliers, I'll get to those in a minute. But one of the things that's important to know is you have to, there's cash and non-cash contributions. So bets of cash out of your pocket versus non-cash, which doesn't require cash, have a different market value. And I'll go over that in a minute. That was one of the big insights that actually makes this work. But the basic premise, though, is that the person's share of the equity should be based on that person's share of the bets. So what Slicing Pie essentially does, it keeps track of who's betting what, and keeps track of who's doing what, and divides the equity based on that. So over time, as things change, the model always stays fair. And there's two pieces to how this works. The first is the allocation framework, which uses that betting model to determine how much equity each person gets. And the second piece is the recovery framework, which decides how to get equity back from someone when they leave the company. And this is critical because people leave the company all the time. The team changes all the time. This animal is called a grunt. You might hear it referred to as a grunt fund. I use that word less and less because it's hard to translate in other languages, but so it's often referred to as a grunt fund. It's a one-size-fits-all solution for the allocation and recovery of equity in an early-stage bootstrap company. That means that there's only one version of this that works properly. If you change the model, it doesn't work. This is the model that uncovers what fairness looks like in your business, and it works the same way all over the world. So I'll start with the allocation framework.
Okay.
In Slicing Pie, instead of poker chips, we use a term called a slice. A slice is a fictional unit of risk that represents the bet that took place. And all it is a marker that keeps track. It's not worth anything by itself. It's just a marker. So what you do is you convert your contributions to slices, and then your shares equal your slices divided by all the slices at any given time. So over time, it'll self-adjust. And to convert to slices, you have to consider cash and non-cash. Non-cash are things like ideas and time, certain facilities, relationships, things that don't require cash out of your pocket. Whereas cash contributions are, cash investments, unreimbursed expenses like plane tickets, credit card bills, things like that. And some things are kind of in between, like a truck or something you might have had. If it's used, it's usually considered non-cash. If it's new, you bought it for the company, it's usually considered cash. So you just take the fair market value, and for every dollar in non-cash, you give yourself two slices. This represents the fact that a bet is taking place, and it's a high-risk bet. Now, cash is different. If I paid you $100 an hour to work for me, and you wanted to buy a thing that cost $100, it would take you longer than an hour to earn enough money. Because when I paid you, I'd pay employment taxes and Social Security taxes. When you receive the money, you'd pay income taxes. And when you bought the thing, you'd pay sales tax or VAT tax. So it may take you 2 hours to earn enough money to buy the one thing. So even though your pay rate is high, when you consider the scarcity of cash, the taxes associated with cash and acquiring products, there's a difference there. So to smooth that out, we actually double the number of slices. You get 4 slices per dollar for cash. And that's where that multiplier comes in. It smooths the fact that cash and non-cash are different. As I mentioned earlier, I started a company without the multipliers a few years ago. And all the employees just assumed that I would pay for everything because there's no incentive for them to invest cash. It didn't give them any additional, so they'd much rather put an hour of their time in for $50 than put $50 cash in. So I wound up going bankrupt, covering all the bets in cash. And so the multiplier helps smooth that out. Now I have an incentive to go on reimburse my expenses or not take a salary.
And Mike, in your book, the statement that I love there is that you said, well, and part of this is also that most people have more time than money.
Right, most people do.
And so And so your time is less of a risk in some ways than the cash, because you have more time than money. And I love the way you put it in the book.
Jeff Bezos makes $8,000 a minute. So he's got more money than time.
That's got
if he sees a Rolex watch on the ground, it's not worth his time to bend down and pick it up. So most of us aren't in that situation, unfortunately. So here's an example. So here's your time. You take your fair market salary, whatever you're worth in the open market for the same kind of work. You subtract cash compensation, because if I pay you, you're not taking any risk. In fact, if I pay you to 100% of your salary, you wouldn't get any equity, and you'd be okay with that because I'm just simply paying you. And most of us work for jobs that pay us a salary and not equity. So you take that unpaid portion and you multiply it by 2 to get your grunt hourly resource rate, or GRR, which is the sound you make when you're hard at work at your startup. Now, assuming 2,000 hours in a year, let's look at an example. So $100,000 a year salary would be $50 an hour for work. So every hour that you're working for a startup and you're not getting paid, you're betting 100 slices. If you're getting paid in part, say $10 an hour, then your risk is only $40 an hour, and you're risking 80 slices per hour. Now, the prospect of keeping track of your time seems annoying, but these are things that most companies track anyway. Most companies that are in business track payroll, they track expenses, they track things. So Slicify just simply asks you to track things that you're not spending during the startup phase. So for instance, cash. To convert cash to slices, you simply take the cash amount that's consumed and multiply it by 4. So if I spend $100 on expenses and I'm not reimbursed, that's 400 slices. Equipment, if I purchase it for the company, it's a cash expense, so it's worth 4 slices per dollar. If I already owned it and it's in my backyard, I use the purchase price as non-cash, or if it's more older than that, I can use the book value. Everything has a fair market value. So for instance, relationships, people are always kind of hung up on, oh, people have big networks. Those are really important. Networks are great as long as they convert to some kind of value. And usually a salesperson that has a good relationship will get a commission on that sale. They can take cash as a commission, or if it's unpaid, it's ×2. Ideas are really important to companies. If they don't generate any revenue, they shouldn't be paid out. A royalty would be the logical way to reward most ideas that are standalone intellectual property. So it's unpaid royalty ×2 if the idea is sort of standalone. And supplies and equipment, reimbursed, unreimbursed expenses are ×4. So everything has a fair market value. And we know this because most companies that are in business pay their bills. They pay commissions, they pay salaries, they reimburse expenses, they pay rent. But startups don't pay those things, so those unpaid amounts are considered bets. So here we are at Startup Grind in New Orleans, some grunts milling around. This one has an idea. She puts in time, puts together a team, she puts in time and money and equipment. She hires a junior developer who puts in just time developing the website, and her rich uncle bankrolls the thing and puts up some important relationships and some credit. So all you do is convert to slices. There's everyone's stuff converted to slices. You add them all up, and you divide each person's share by the total. There's 2 and 3. And now the pie looks like this. It makes sense that that uncle who bankrolled the thing has more shares than everybody else because he put more risk up. So at this moment in time, if the company reached break even or Series A investment, this would represent the equity split. But let's add somebody. This is Barry. He's a sales guy, lots of big Rolodex. He puts in some time and forms some important relationships. You simply convert his stuff to slices like everybody else. You add into the total, and you divide each person's share again. Now, assuming no one else does any work this period, the new split would look like this. Now, everyone else a little bit less. If the rich uncle was not willing to budge on his share, the founder and the junior developer would have to duke it out to see who gives Barry his shares. And they would shrink and shrink and shrink when the rich uncle took advantage of them. But in this case, the pie is properly adjusted to reflect the relative value of each person's bet. So again, if it broke even here or reached Series A, this would represent exactly the fair split. Just like in blackjack, the split is proper. So if somebody leaves the company, we got to get their equity back from them. And there's 4 reasons why someone can leave a company. The first reason is they can be fired for good reason. Being fired for good reason is usually performance-based. You're not doing your job, you get warning, warning, fired. You always got to give someone a warning before you fire them because they have to have a chance to correct their behavior. Unless it's so gone.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but we got a question from the audience, and I wanted, before you moved on, because it's from Benjamin Legume here over in New Orleans, and it's, how is time factored in? Example, people coming on at different stages.
So that's the wonderful part about it. People do come in at different times. So on day one, they have bet nothing. They bet zero. They have 0 slices in the pie. At the end of the first 8-hour day, they have 8 hours times their hourly rate times the multiplier, and they have a little bit of slices. A year goes by, they have a lot of slices. So this only takes into account the bets that are made. What most people try to do is try to predict how much time you're going to put into a project and try to predict what the project is when it's going to break even, and try to chunk up equity like that. But in this case, you walk up to the table and start betting, and your bet counts. So pretend we're at the blackjack table again. Let's say we get another MosquitOasis on the table. We want to double down again, and someone covers our bet at $4 at 4 chips. So now someone's bet 4 chips, you've bet 3 chips, and I've bet 1 chip. It's clear what the equity split should be at that point. So as time goes on, their slices will build and build and build until they're no longer making any bets. So it's ideal for companies to have people coming and going, which is part of the problem with traditional splits. So thanks for asking. That's a good question.
Okay, you've got a couple more coming through now. So let me finish up with Ben's question here. So what about the de-risking that occurs due to the work cash put in at an earlier stage rather than a later stage?
Well, that's an interesting question. I appreciate you asking that. We can't know the de-risking that's available. It's impossible to know the chance of a survival for a startup company at any given time, any more than we can know whether Apple Computer is going to go up tomorrow or down tomorrow on the stock market. It's just not. It's not a knowable number. We tend to think that over time the risk goes down, but risk could actually go up as cash resources are depleted and time goes on. The risk of failure could actually go up. So the last dollar could be more important than the first dollar to save the company. So because we can't measure that, there's no practical way to measure that. We can't account for that in the model, and we don't account for it in the model.
Okay, and you've got one more from Anastasia Ferrari, and it's, since there's money involved, then money regulators get involved?
That's a good question. So usually in a startup, so we're not out selling a security in this situation. A slice does not represent a share of stock. It does not represent a promise to anybody. It just represents a bet. And in startup companies, it's typical for founders to invest cash and resources over time. They're not soliciting outside investors. When you do start soliciting outside vendors, there is regulation that applies for sure. And you should work with a lawyer. I have dozens of lawyers on slicingpie.com that work with startups all over the world, and they can walk you through those regulations. But absolutely, if you're soliciting outside funds, then securities law plays a big role. But when you're working with your close-knit internal team, it's less of an issue because the slices don't technically represent any particular share of stock. If you have, because it could change on a daily basis. Once your stock is issued, that's a little bit different story. But there are certain regulations, just like any company has, that you need to adhere to. Slicing Pie doesn't introduce any new rules or problems with those kind of laws. It's just like any other company. If you think about it, every company that starts changes the split over time. It always changes. It's just, this gives you a model for making decisions. So in that respect, it's just the same as anything else.
Gotcha. Okay. And for the audience, if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll keep going on in here. And in about 10 or 15 minutes, we'll start asking some more questions from the audience. But I want to give you a couple minutes to finish your run through on the model. Okay,
that's good. And you can stop me if you want to. So fired for good reason implies you weren't performing and you got warning, fired. If you don't give someone a chance to correct their behavior, it's not fair. Unless they're doing something that's so clearly inappropriate that you get fired for, like embezzlement, for instance. No, you're clearly fired for embezzlement or bringing a gun to work or sexually harassing somebody. But usually, if it's performance related, you got to give someone a warning. If you don't give them a warning, which you can do, you're firing them for no good reason. So without warning, for your own reasons is considered no good reason. You can also resign for good reason. Resigning for good reason implies that the company made promises that it couldn't keep. I might have said to you, come on board and I'll pay you the salary in 6 months. And 6 months later it rolls around and there's no salary. That's good reason to resign. Or I might say, we're based in New Orleans, we're moving to Seattle, pack your bags, move your kids. That's not what you signed up for, so you have good reason to resign. And this is important because startups are notorious for making promises that it can't keep. So it's got to be careful about the promises it makes to employees. And if it does, it's got to be willing to pony up the solutions. The last one is you can resign for no good reason. Meaning I don't believe in the company anymore. I can't afford to work for free anymore. I don't like the people I'm working with. I can quit for my own reasons, which is fine. The person can make the decision. If you're fired for good reason or you resign for no good reason, you're leaving the company in the lurch. You're basically walking away from your bet. So you lose your slices for non-cash contributions and you lose your multiplier for cash contributions. It's painful to leave under these circumstances, as it should be. If you want to participate in the bet, don't walk away from your bet. If you're a solo entrepreneur and you walk away from your company, you lose everything. The same thing basically applies here too, to impose consequences on the person leaving. On the flip side of the coin, if you resign for good reason or you're fired for no good reason, your slices stay in the pie and you get equity along with everybody else. So your bet is represented alongside everybody else's. So you're protected in case something happens. So here's an example. So here's our team again. The junior developer isn't doing her job. She gets a warning number 1. She continues to not do her job. Warning number 2. Third time she's fired. All she had on the table was time. So the time goes away. You simply take her slices out of the pie and recalculate everyone's shares. There's number 2, 3, and 4. Now the pie looks like this. The pie is automatically adjusted to reflect the fact that her bet no longer counts because she's walked away from it. And this is redistributed properly to reflect the relative value of everyone's bets. Now, sooner or later, you'll get enough money to pay your bills and pay everybody, and you'll want to bake the pie, and it turns a crisp golden brown. The times you do it are break even or Series A. So break even implies you're generating enough revenue to cover your expenses and salaries. So you might start paying nothing per hour, and then so this is a full bet, but as the company generates revenue, can choose to pay that to employees or pay their expenses, so their bet goes down over time. The more you pay per hour, the lower your bet goes, until on a go-forward basis, you're being paid in full, and the betting naturally stops. So the pie naturally stops accumulating slices, at which point what's left over is profits, and you can either retain those profits as retained earnings, or you can distribute them to shareholders, and slicing pie determines the distribution of those dividends. This is the bet paying off. Just like in blackjack, the 2/3 1/3 split, or the 75-25 split. The other way you can break the pie is to raise a Series A investment. A Series A investor raises enough. You raise enough money, you can cover your expenses in the foreseeable future. So in this example, we're going to negotiate a $900,000 pre-money valuation and raise $1 million. So you got $1.9 million post-money valuation, which means you sold 53% of the company. You use that money to pay bills and pay salaries. And now when the profits come in, you have to share with the Series A investor. So what you get is a perfectly fair model. You're rewarding the actual contributions people make, not what they say they're going to do, their promises, what they're actually doing. You're providing ongoing motivation to the team. You're accommodating team changes. You're flexible in the face of rapid change, and you're getting rid of the gators. There's no fights about equity because you always know you're getting what's going to be the right amount. Now, there's 3 reasons why someone would not want to use this. The first reason is they don't get it. And you mentioned to me earlier you had to read the book twice for it to click. And that's really important because I spend a lot of my time trying to get this to click with people. There's plenty of resources. There's books about this. The Slicing Pie Handbook is the one you want. There's a new book coming out called Will Work for Pie, coming out in December or next year. The book has been translated into a dozen different languages. There's software. There's all kinds of resources to learn this. There's games. There's all kinds of stuff on my website. So if you don't get it, it doesn't click, please come to me and reach out. There's all kinds of free stuff. I want the world to know how this works. The second reason someone's not going to use Slicing Pie is because they're not willing to learn it. If they're not willing to learn it, that's a problem. It's a red flag. And I always advise you to steer clear of people like that because they're just not willing to learn new things. It's a problem. And the third reason is they do get it, but it's their intent to take advantage of you. And this happens, sometimes startups are desperate and their investors can take advantage of them. Just be careful with those people and know that you're getting taken advantage of. But once the model clicks with you, you'll realize that as nice as a fixed split is, that you know what you're going to get. Fixed splits are great because you know what you're going to get. The problem is whatever you get is going to be the wrong number. In a dynamic split and Slicing Pie, you don't know what you're going to get at the outset. But the good news is whatever you get, it's going to be the right number.
So Mike, what about the people that as you kind of talked about earlier, that when you're cataloging your time, So again, let's say you're a software developer and it's going to take X amount of hours, and they just refuse to record their time. They're for one reason or another. What are some of the reasons that you've heard from people about why they can't record their time or they won't record their time to keep track of their slices? And how do you approach those people and work with those people? Because I've seen that many times myself, that it's well, I'm doing the work. Why do you want me now to do this extra level of cataloging?
Right, and I wholeheartedly see your point of view, and I personally hate tracking my time. And I participate in slicing pie companies, and it's a total drag. And I don't like filing expense reports at work either. And I don't, so I don't like billing my clients. There's certain things about business that I just don't like. You can track your time in whatever level of granularity you're comfortable with. If you want to say, we're just going to mark up a month of time at full-time employees, no problem. If you want to track by the week, by the hour, by the minute, it's up to you what your team is comfortable with. It's up to you. You just want to make sure you're consistent and have a policy in place. Some people might charge lump sums. Some people might get a commission. There's all kinds of different ways to pay people. In fact, my new book is about how to pay people different ways. If you get someone who's not willing to track their time, then they're not going to get paid. If the developer doesn't send you the invoice, you're not going to know what it is. I mean, think about it as easy as that. If you're sending an invoice to the company and it's paid, you didn't make a bet. If the invoice isn't paid, then it's a bet. And people are the same way. Filling out a time card or an employment slip is just the same thing. So, but you can do whatever level of granularity you're comfortable with. And the software that I have, which is optional, it integrates with Harvest and Toggle and some better time tracking tools, make it a little bit easier.
And your software, I've played with it, and I just want to make sure that when I logged in, if you just use it yourself, personal for one person, not as a company, it's a free software that you have. And then if you want to set up as your company, it really does make it easy. I've been playing with it for a couple of months now, and it goes through and it'll ask you, like in drop down menus, okay, how much is your salary? How many hours did you work in what time frame do you want this to be repeating? And so a question about that in salary, and you touched on this, but if you have somebody that says, well, my salary is usually, let's say $500 an hour, but you don't really need that you want to work with this person because you're friends with them or for whatever reason, but you don't need somebody that has that skill set. So in other words, they might be a great computer programmer, but you don't need a computer programmer. You need somebody that's a salesperson.
That's a great,
and so
it's a great point. And this is one of the beautiful things here, is you got to make rational financial decisions. So imagine the person who's expecting $500 an hour and you didn't talk about it. And so you get to break even or some cash flow. He says, I want to start getting paid. That's $1 million a year. That's a huge salary. If you'd be blindsided by that, if you didn't have the conversation up front. So the slicing pie, you have this conversation up front, you figure out what the person's expectations are, and you can make a rational decision based on that information. I can't afford a $500 an hour person on this project. I need a $60 an hour person. So you can have that conversation up front. You're making decisions as if you're running your company with cash. You're just using slices instead. That's one of the nice things about it. And so that problem has actually come up not too infrequently. Not long ago, there's a lawyer who was $700 an hour. They didn't need a $750 an hour attorney to set up their corporation for them. They didn't need a clerk, like a paralegal. So he hired a paralegal and he paid her $60 an hour, and she did the work for him, and he paid her cash, and that was his slice of the pie. So it's just more of a logical contribution. It makes you rethink. I don't need your time. I need somebody's time. So you always got to think about what's the fair market value of somebody.
And that leads into one of the other things I really liked in your book is the idea of a magic card, that you went into that idea for this. And if you could go into that a little bit more, because I found it really interesting that it's not the amount of money that I donate. Like, let's say I come in as a big investor and I say, you're a startup company, I'm going to give you $100,000. Well, the company doesn't really need that much money. And so it's not how much money you donate to it, because it's how much money that you actually spend from the company. that it translates into slices. And why do you, and why do you have it set up that way? Because I found this to be a really neat part of the way to do
There's a couple of
things.
concepts there that are important. The magic ATM card is one thing you mentioned. That's from the first book, Slicing Pie. The Slicing Pie Handbook is a rewrite of the book. I recommend. I'll send you a copy of that one. But the magic ATM card says the magic ATM card will pay for everything in your company as long as you're making good decisions. So you wouldn't buy a $500 an hour person, for instance. You wouldn't buy a Herman Miller Aeron chair that's $2,500. You wouldn't buy, those things you wouldn't do. So it forces you to make good decisions. And what's important is when you invest money, it's not at risk. If you gave me $100,000, it's just sitting in my bank account. The only risk is that I'm a jerk and I'm not going to give it back to you in your ass. But if you wanted it back, I theoretically could pay it back. It's just sitting in the bank. When I consume it, when I spend it, it becomes a risk. And what that does is it forces you to make smart decisions, because I know every dollar I spend of cash, I'm giving up 4 slices of my pie. So I make smart decisions on the money. Plus, I can't swamp the pie. If you accounted for the money up all up front, I could put $1 million in the bank, get 4 million slices, own 90% of the pie, and not spend any of the money.
The day before it goes to Series A.
It prevents you from gaming it.
Now I'm putting in, a ton of money. So now I want to own the company because of this model. So it keeps you from I guess, again, being unfair with the model. And that's what I like about this is that throughout your books, you go through the idea of this being fair equity, that you want what's fair for yourself, but you also want to make sure that's what's fair for your partners. And that's when you go into the idea of having somebody leave a company versus being fired from a company, that you touched on this, that if right before I go to Series A, I turn around to all the other people there and say, well, you're just fired from the company. It's not fair to them what you've done there. So it protects them from that happening also.
They could do that, but that's still represented. So the scenario I was talking about earlier, there's a company I started a few years ago where our operating agreement had one line in it that gave one of my partner the ability to buy people's share back at zero value. That one line, so you could work for 5 years and be fully vested, and he could buy it back from you. I mean, he got away with it. We agreed to it. Our lawyers looked at it. That doesn't mean it's fair. Just like in blackjack, we had a 50-50 agreement. I could sue you and probably win, but that doesn't make it fair. Just because you agree to something doesn't make it fair. So what Slicing Pie does is it always gives you the right conversation to have about what is fair and what's not fair. Flooding the pie at the last minute is not fair. Padding your hours isn't fair. It just says, what bets do you have on the table? And let's take those into account.
And so again, I've got a bunch of questions for you, but if anybody else from the audience has questions, put them through the chat and we'll answer them as we go along. We've got about another 10 minutes here before 6, and we'll have to cut off then. So if you've got questions and want to talk some more, please ask the questions now. So just kind of on the idea of slicing pie, and before you started with the model of slicing pie, what's like what you've seen as the worst experience of a fixed split? And you don't have to name names or anything like that, but your examples of something that you've seen is kind of like the worst case scenario that could happen with a fixed split.
One thing I see a lot of, there's movies about this. The Facebook movies are basically about an equity split issue. Steve Jobs, there's always these issues with equity splits that are fixed splits. There's one movie that came out years ago. It's called Startup.com. You probably haven't seen it. It was a documentary about a company. It's called GovWorks. And there were 3 founders that raised hundreds of millions of dollars from VC companies. And there were 3 founders. One of them flaked out in the beginning. And the remaining founders wound up paying him $800,000 for his shares. He was the only person out of all the investors that made any money at all, was the guy who flaked out in the beginning. If they had used Slicing Pie, he would have gotten about $20,000. That would have been what he deserved, given the amount of risk he took. But everyone else put in hundreds of millions of dollars. They dedicated 3 or 4 years of their lives, no pay. It's just a horrible example of the person who flakes out, gets bought out, and is the only person that makes any money. It's always a heartbreaker to see these buyouts of these founders that leave. With Slicing Pie, you know exactly what your deal is. I can quit if I want to. I can walk away if I want to. I have that option, but I can't expect my bet to pay off if I'm walking away. And you can fire me if you want, but you can't take my money if you do. So it always plays out.
Yeah, and again, it makes sense when you think about it as a betting table. It makes sense. If you just walk away from your bet, you're never going to collect on that. Yeah. So what was your I know you've been working in the entrepreneur field for a long time, and you're adapting slicing pie into a lot of different curriculums right now. Could you give us a little bit about how you're putting this into actual curriculum, classes, things like that right now?
Well, I do teach slicing pie in all my classes, and one of the things I find is it's very common in student startups, especially. You'll get a team of people working together on a student project without having this conversation at all, and they'll get to the end of the quarter and they'll actually have something that could potentially have some value, and they'll all want the piece of it. And I see this time almost every semester. There's some company that starts that actually looks kind of cool. They want to start it, and there's always an argument about equity splits because the person who didn't do anything, I'm just kind of the freeloader on the team thinks he has an equal share or she has an equal share. So it's very common that these mistakes happen. So I do this classes. I do the selection in my classes a lot. I also do a lot of webinars and seminars with other professors all over the country. I've taught this in a lot of different places. But it's a really important thing to get out on the table. People who really understand this have been burned before. One of the biggest things I get is, I wish I had this 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Because once you've really been through it, you feel how bad it feels. There's got to be a better solution. When you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and it's your first time doing a startup, what could possibly go wrong? We're 50 buddies. I've had prenuptial agreements written in slicing pie. I actually had a couple come to me and say, we're going to buy a house together. My wife wants to spend money remodeling the house. I don't. How do we account for the house in our estate? And so the money she put in remodeling all went into their house pie, and it's actually in their prenuptial agreement.
I was going to ask you, what was that might be the answer. What was the strangest usage that you've ever seen for
definitely that one.
And
but the guy had been married before, and his wife took all his money. And he was nervous about that. They both had some wealth. They're an older couple. They're well into retirement. Their kids were worried about it, and the guy knew about the book and said his wife, they both agreed to it, and it worked out great because she could buy whatever she wanted for the house. He said, "I don't care what she buys for the house. I don't care what she remodels. I'm great for her to do it. I just don't want to take advantage of her. I don't want to I don't make the families to get burned." But it's great for movie projects and a lot of creative projects to do it. Really, any bootstrap startup, I've seen it work all over the world.
So what was the very first startup that you've worked on yourself? I know you've been in a lot. I mean, from your youngest age, what was the first one that put you on this path? And how did we talked a little bit about this before, but how did you come up with this model from that very first startup? Because I know you've been, again, working on this for a long time. But what was that
my first startup?
Just an overview.
I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian when I was a kid. And I had lots of pets. I had 50 pets at one time. I had rabbits and geese and dogs and all kinds of things. And I bred my rabbits many times. It never worked. One summer, I had 25 baby rabbits. And they were super cute and super fun, but I had no idea what I was going to do with them all. And my aunt said, take a box. There's an art fair going on downtown, and take the box of rabbits and get people to hold them. When they hold the rabbits, they're going to buy one. I sold 24 baby rabbits that afternoon. And the next day, someone came and bought the last one for $25 each. And it was so thrilling to think that I could produce something people wanted to pay a lot of money for. I was willing to give them away. But $25 back in the 80s was a nice chunk of change for a pet. And it was all just impulse purchases. And that kind of got me rolling. And then when I got to college, wasn't a very good student. My parents said, you can come home and get a job, or you can pay for it yourself. So instead of getting a job, I started a company. And this was a kind of a paralyzing situation, because I had friends that I wanted to work for me and work with me, but they wanted to go in half with me. They wanted to go in, and I didn't know anything about equity or how it worked. And I really struggled to do that. And I did hire people, but I paid them a salary, and I was forced to grow. But I always struggled with this idea because as the whole sole owner of the company, all of the risk was mine. I had to pay everybody first before I got myself paid. So it was a big struggle. And, 3 years, just gone from startup to real company to startup, back and forth, just getting burned. I started a company once where I gave the developer 75% of the equity to do the software. He did it in 2 weeks. So here I was, had all the rest of the work. I destroyed my company with that deal. I didn't know better. So now I know better. And if you think about this model and you think about it long enough, you realize that it always produces the right answer. No matter what transpires, no matter who comes, no matter who leaves, no matter what kind of decisions you make, no matter what kind of pivots you make, no matter what, it always self-adjusts to be fair. And all kinds of things that you never can predict. It's always unpredictable. I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow. But this always accounts for that, and it does it in a very elegant way. That's totally logical.
And again, the point about being fair, I think every one of us fall into this, that it's hard to see sometimes beyond yourself, that you may sit there without having this model, and you may think, well, it's fair for me to own this much of the company or this, because you're not really reflecting on your effort and your time that you put in. So this kind of forces you to sit down with the other people you're working with and really set what is fair. I've had a lot of people before that I'd sit there and say, well, I feel like you've gotten rich off of my back, and they would come back to me with the same thing. So how about Anastasia wrote again here, how do you cope when you have to stop investing in a business that gets too expensive?
So that's a good question. Thanks for asking. So as time goes on, and this is one of the most heartbreaking things I hear about startups, is they keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going, and there's no out for people. Slicify gives you an out. If the going gets too tough, you can walk away and not have to spend. You're not forced to spend. So in a fixed split scenario, if we're 50-50 partners and we have expenses piling up, I expect you to pay your half. I expect you to do that. And so there's this built-in expectation. But if you can't afford to pay anymore, you stop paying for expenses and just back out. There's an out. Mm-hmm. And you do that sooner rather than later. In Slicify, there's an incentive to put cash. As long as you believe in the business, you'll continue to contribute to the business. If you stop believing in the business, you should have a choice not to believe in the business. If you're a part owner of a fixed split, you're in this weird situation where you're expected to pony up cash. So, if it was getting too expensive, I can just say, listen, I can't cover expenses anymore. And that's that. If no one's willing to cover expenses, no one believes in the business anymore, and the business goes out of business, which it probably should. So that's something that's always on my mind when I talk to people. I've got people who talk to me that been in business 4 or 5 years and not turned to salary. It seems pretty they're beating a dead horse. But one thing you mentioned earlier was keeping account of your own time. One of the most common scenarios that I get is people are already entered into a fixed split, and they realize they made a mistake, and they find slicing pie. There's a chapter in the book called Retrofits, which helps you think back to what happened in the past so you can determine your split at a later point in time. And the software, which is optional, is free for solo founders, so you can start getting in the habit of tracking your time and tracking your contributions. It's a big eye-opener when you really start tracking your contributions, because you understand what your cost structures are. If I don't track what I'm doing, I don't really have a good feel for what it took to get there. So if I got 6 people doing 80 hours a week, I may not be very proud of the outcome if I knew they were spending that much time. So it really helps you understand, what your cost structures are, where your pain points are, and helps you run your business like a real company. But retrofitting is very common, and tracking solo founders is very common too. Probably a third of the people who use the software, or a fourth, are just solo entrepreneurs tracking it for free at this time.
And the other thing you mentioned with that in the books is that if you are going to your Series A, then when you can walk into the room and say, well, look, this is how much time each of us have spent. This is how much it really takes to run this company. That you've already got everything basically laid out.
Awesome due diligence.
And that it's
no questions. It's all right there.
Yeah. Have you ever had anybody from like Series A investors come back to you and say, this changed our opinion when we were looking at this company?
I have had people.
Anything?
I have had people say that to me. And there's been some big, really interesting deals. It was Panama, the largest Series A round in the history of Panama, was a slicing pie company. It wasn't a huge round, but it was exciting because they were a slicing pie deal. I've never ever heard of a company saying we're not going to invest because of slicing pie. What investors want is a clean, conflict-free cap table. That's exactly what slicing pie delivers.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I know we're just about running out of time here. We've got about a minute left on my my side, because we cut off at 6 on the nose, and the software is set to shut down at 6. So I just wanted to, kind of wind things down and thank everybody for attending today. It has been a great time talking with you, Mike. If you want to put into the chat session, I know you've got a website and your information, just in case if anybody wants to reach out to Mike and chat with him some more. He's been great to chat with both here today, and I know I've talked to you by email several times, and I definitely look forward to having you come to New Orleans and present again for us in person once everything kind of ends up with COVID here.
I look forward to that too.
Like I said, yep, we do New Orleans Entrepreneur Week, and I'd love to have you down and talk with some of the people that organize Entrepreneur Week here and have you down for that the next time we do it.
I'd love that. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to talk to you.
Thank you all so much. Everybody have a good night and stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.